So one question I get a lot about the book of Revelation is, what does it say about the rapture and the tribulation? And that's a fairly common idea that you hear in church, is that there's a future period known as the Great Tribulation, and what's the relationship of the rapture, the idea of a rapture, the snatching up of God's people. And I was raised in a church that taught a pre-tribulational rapture. So the tribulation was a period of time in the future, and God would rapture and snatch the church up before that period so that they wouldn't go through the tribulation. And so people read Revelation and often wonder, well, where's the mention of the rapture? And what does it say about the tribulation? So I want to take this time to talk a little bit about what Revelation says about the tribulation and the rapture. The clearest place where the rapture is taught, this idea of catching up or snatching up, is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, in the context of the resurrection passage. And Paul refers to those that are left when Christ returns will be caught up and snatched up. And the question then is, well, when does that happen? And what's this tribulation, or this great tribulation? So the first thing I want to do is look at, what does the book of Revelation say about the rapture, or this catching up? Well, there's actually two places in Revelation that could be seen as referring to a catching up or a rapture. One of them is found in chapter 4, the very beginning of chapter 4, and where John he looks up and sees an open door in heaven, and he's caught up to heaven. He's taken up to heaven. And some have said, well, that's kind of a picture of the rapture or something like that. But actually, that text has nothing to do with the rapture. That is just a typical scenario for having a vision. That's just preparation for John's vision. It has nothing to do with him being raptured or our rapture or anything like that. It's just a preparation for John to have a vision of the heavenly throne room in chapter 4 and 5, and probably the rest of the book as well. So we'll kind of leave that passage aside, because it really doesn't have anything to do with an end time rapture or God's people being snatched up or caught up. The other possible place that you find a reference to a rapture that might be a little bit closer is in chapter 11. At some point, we can maybe talk about this passage at more length in one of these sessions. But the two witnesses, this is the story of the two witnesses, and I take it that the two witnesses symbolize, or they're metaphorical for the entire church, the calling on the church to be a faithful witness, to be a prophetic witness in the world. And we read that after the period of witness, the beast rises out of the sea and out of the abyss and puts them to death. And then we read that after a time, after 3.5 days, they come to life, they stand up, and then they are apparently taken up into heaven. And that might be the closest example of a passage that refers to the rapture. And the word rapture, the same word that you find in 1 Thessalonians 4, isn't used there, but certainly the idea of them being raised up and then taken to heaven might suggest the idea of a rapture. So that's really all we read about in Revelation. Revelation doesn't talk much about a rapture. In fact, the New Testament doesn't say much about it outside of 1 Thessalonians 4. But this might be in chapter 11, this might be the closest passage that you find to a rapture. But that still doesn't help us determine, when does it take place? When does this rapture take place? Or this event of being caught up into heaven? And let me say too, a lot of how you understand this doesn't depend only on the book of Revelation. A lot of it depends on how you put the pieces of the puzzle of the rest of the Bible together. Whether you see the church and Israel as two distinct things, so that the things about the tribulation and the second coming all refer to Israel, and the church is a different body. The church is a different group, and they'll be raptured up before all these things happen to Israel. So sometimes how you understand the rest of the New Testament, how you understand eschatology or end time stuff more generally, and other things like what's the relationship between the church and Israel, will affect what you conclude about when the rapture takes place. But the main question is, when does it take place in comparison to it or in relationship to the tribulation? So according to Revelation, when does this tribulation take place? Do we find the word tribulation used in the book of Revelation? And when does it take place? Is it something that lies only in the future? Is it something that has not yet taken place, that will take place right before the second coming of Christ, before which we will be taken up and raptured? Or when does Revelation tell us that this period of tribulation will take place? And then the other part of the puzzle is, we often think, well, the tribulation is a 7-year period. You've often heard that, maybe. 7 years of tribulation, that the period of tribulation at the very end of history, right before Christ comes back, will be a 7-year period. So where do we find that in the book of Revelation? Well, let me start by saying there is one place where you actually find the words Great Tribulation. And that is in chapter 7. If you remember chapter 7, the second part of it, John has a vision of a great multitude standing before the throne in heaven, worshiping God. And John then sees this multitude, and then he asks, I think the angel that's accompanying him asks, who are these? Or no, the angel asks him, who are these people? And John says, you know. And then the angel tells him, these are those, in verse 14, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation. So probably chapter 7 is kind of a vision in advance of God's people standing in the future in heaven before God's throne. And it tells us that prior to this, they have come through the great tribulation. Again, this doesn't help us to ask, well, when is the Great Tribulation? Again, is it a future period of time? When does it start? How are we to understand it? What is this Great Tribulation that John refers to, that these people have come out of? When does it take place? Well, I would suggest to you that, number one, the tribulation, I think Revelation is pretty clear, the tribulation, or this great tribulation, refers to the entire period between the first coming of Christ, his death and resurrection, and his second coming. The whole period of church history is the period of tribulation, or the great tribulation. So it's not a period just at the very end of history that we're still waiting for to happen. It's the whole period between the death and resurrection of Christ and his second coming in the future. That whole period of church history is the period of tribulation, or the Great Tribulation. And second, that must mean that it's not a period of 7 years. In fact, in Revelation, we'll see John does use some time designations to refer to the tribulation, but it's not 7 years. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So where do I get this understanding that the tribulation refers to the whole period, starting with the death and resurrection of Christ and continuing until Christ comes back? Well, in chapter 12 of Revelation, we read this story of a dragon that pursues a child, and clearly the child is Jesus Christ. And we're told that the dragon actually is waiting and pursues a woman first. This woman is pregnant with a child, and the child's clearly Jesus Christ, because John describes him as the one who has an iron scepter and who will shepherd the nations with his scepter. A clear reference from the Psalms to Jesus Christ. So that's clearly Christ. And the woman gives birth to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ, the Son, and he's immediately snatched up into heaven. And then it says the dragon immediately goes after the woman's offspring, which would be the people of God. They're described in chapter 12, towards the end of the chapter, as those who maintain the witness of Jesus and keep his commands. A clear reference, that language is used elsewhere to refer to the churches in chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches. So clearly, these children of the woman are meant to describe or to represent the church, the people of God. Yet notice that it appears that the dragon goes after the woman's offspring immediately after Jesus, the Son, is taken up into heaven. Kind of a condensed reference to his resurrection, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension to heaven. Then immediately the dragon goes after the woman's offspring. And I said the offspring, I think, represent the church, the people of God, those that keep the testimony of Jesus, those that obey his commands. That is the church, the people of God. But notice there doesn't appear to be a gap. In other words, if you think the tribulation, and that's what's being described in chapter 12, the dragon persecuting the woman's offspring, most people would agree that's the period of tribulation. But if that's still future, then you'd have to argue, there must be a gap, a lengthy time period in between the snatching of the child up into heaven and this period of tribulation. But that's not what Revelation 12 tells us. And in fact, I think it makes it clear that the reason why the dragon goes after the woman's offspring is because of the way that the dragon has been defeated is through the death of Jesus Christ. So everything starts with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ in chapter 12. And then immediately the dragon goes after the woman's offspring and pursues them and persecutes them. So I would suggest to you that chapter 12 of Revelation is the clearest indication that this period of tribulation begins at the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then what you find in Revelation is the series of, there's 7 seal judgments, 7 trumpet judgments, and 7 bowl judgments. Those are probably different ways of describing the judgments that take place, again, during this whole period of church history, starting with the death and resurrection of Christ and eventually ending with his second coming. Now, what about the 7 years? Well, if you look at chapter 11, 12, and 13, this is the only place where you find time periods referring to this period of tribulation. And what you find is that this period of tribulation, Revelation tells us, will last 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. If you do a little bit of math, you'll find that those basically refer to the same period of time. You add them up, and 42 months is 1,260 days, and that's also roughly 3.5 years. Now, as I've said before, even the numbers and the time periods in Revelation are meant to be taken symbolically. They're not referring to periods of time, but they're not literally describing them. They're saying something about the character and the nature of the period of time, but they're not telling us how long they'll last. So what does 3.5 years suggest? Well, it suggests probably it's half of 7. However intense this period of time gets for the people of God, between the death and resurrection of Christ and his second coming, however intense it gets, it won't last. It falls far short of the perfect number 7. 42 months recalls the number 40 that referred to Israel's testing in the desert in the Old Testament. It's an Old Testament number. So by saying it's 42 months, John wants us to recall the Old Testament, and he wants to tell us this period of tribulation between the death and resurrection of Christ and his second coming will be a period of testing for the church, just like there was a period of testing for Israel in the Old Testament. The 1,260 days, again, may probably just suggest however long this period seems to go on, however intense it seems to get, it's going to come to an end. It's not going to last. So these numbers are not meant to be taken literally, that it's referring to a literal period of time. Instead, what is important is the theological idea of these numbers, what they suggest about the character and the meaning of this time, not its length. And you'll notice where you don't find the number 7 in there. Well, some people say, well, if you add some of those up, you get 7. But which ones do you add up? If you, in fact, wherever you see the number 3.5 years, 42 months, and 1,260 days, if you add them all up, you get way more than 7 years. You get closer to 15 or something like that. So when I read Revelation, I don't see John telling us anywhere that, oh, you need to, some of these refer to half the tribulation, the first 3.5 years, and the others refer to the second 3.5 years. No, each of those numbers in their entirety refers to the whole period of tribulation. They're just different ways of looking at it. So to kind of draw this in conclusion, as I read the book of Revelation, 2 things. Number 1, I find that the period of tribulation refers to the entire period between the death and resurrection of Christ and the second coming of Christ as a period of tribulation. In other words, the early church was already going through tribulation in the first century and will continue until Christ returns at his second coming. And those numbers, 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, are not meant to tell us how long it will last, but are meant to tell us something about the character of it. It's a time of testing. However intense, it's not going to last. It's going to be cut short. And then, as far as the rapture, then, I take it that the only event that Revelation refers to is at the second coming of Christ, that the church will then go through the period of tribulation. They have all since the death and resurrection of Christ. And then at the end of that time, Christ will return. And then if you want to fit the rapture in somewhere, that's where it will take place, at the very end of this period of tribulation. And so hopefully that helps you see the tribulation and issue of the rapture in a little bit different light, at least from the perspective of John's teaching on it in the book of Revelation.